Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our Heritage website. Would ask everyone here in-house to make that last courtesy check that your cell phones or anything else that makes noise is turned off before we begin. It will be appreciated. So wonderful when the speaker's not expecting a phone call in the middle of his remarks.
Thanks for the reminder.
You'll be surprised. We do, of course, welcome internet questions at any time, and those viewers are welcome to send them to speaker@heritage.org via email. And of course, we will post the program within 24 hours on our Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. Hosting our guest today is our Ronald Reagan Distinguished Fellow Emeritus, Edwin Meese. As well as that distinction, he was, of course, the 75th Attorney General of the United States, as well as a wonderful advisor to President Reagan, both as governor and president of the United States. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Ed Meese. Mr. Meese.
Thank you, John, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I join in welcoming all of you to a very interesting session this morning. One of the great privileges of being in the Reagan administration was, of course, working with Ronald Reagan. But it also was working with a number of very talented and very bright people that he brought together. And one of them is our speaker this morning. Henry Nau is currently professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University. He also has another job that he is working very assiduously on, and that is maintaining our relationships with Japan and South Korea and helping to promote United States interests in the Pacific. He's been working on international matters during the Reagan administration. He served on President Reagan's National Security Council staff, where he was the senior staff member responsible for international economics. He also has served in academic positions elsewhere. He was a colleague of mine during 2011 to 2012 at the Hoover Institution, where he was the Glenn and Rita Campbell National Fellow, and also the Susan Louise Dyer Peace National Fellow at that institution. He has also been active in a number of other international matters. He was prior to serving in the Reagan administration, he was a special assistant to the Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs. Today, he brings us his newest book, that's entitled Conservative Internationalism, Armed Diplomacy under Jefferson, Polk, Truman, and Reagan, which was published in August of this year. It's kind of interesting to have the juxtaposition of those two words, armed and diplomacy, since the activities that go on in the Department of Defense and the Department of the State often seem to be at loggerheads. What Henry will be talking about today really is returning to the kind of diplomacy, or what I would call world leadership really, that was experienced under presidents like Jefferson, Polk, Harry Truman, and Ronald Reagan. And so I think you'll find this a very interesting book to read, and the book copies will be available, I understand, afterwards that can be purchased here, but also to hear from Henry Nau. Please join me in welcoming him to the platform.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Meese. It's a great privilege to be here and, most importantly, to be introduced by Mr. Meese. I'll come back to that in just a moment. Whenever I step outside of the academic world, I'm always reminded of what Dwight Eisenhower once said about an intellectual. He says, you know, there are people who talk a long time and use a lot of words to tell you more than they actually know. Well, Eisenhower was a pretty wise fellow, and I hope I'm not going to measure up to his definition of an intellectual this morning. I want to start with a rather dire prediction and proceed from there. Let me see if I can do this now. I think that we are today making a huge mistake right at this very moment. And when I say we, I mean the American people. I mean you and me. That's going to cost us dearly in both treasure and blood in the next few years, in the not too distant future. Now, what do I mean? Well, I believe we are repeating an historic pattern of overreach and then withdrawal. 10 years ago, the American people voted overwhelmingly to attack Afghanistan and Iraq. Today, they are voting overwhelmingly to hightail it home and never to put boots on the ground again in Syria or anywhere else. Now, this happened after World War I, after World War II, after Korea, after Vietnam, and now again after Iraq and Afghanistan. Each time, withdrawal has been followed by attacks, once again, on the United States. After our withdrawal in the interwar period, Pearl Harbor followed. After our handing over the world to the United Nations in 1945, the Berlin blockade followed. After the Korean War and Eisenhower's policies of reducing U.S. defense expenditures, the Berlin Wall and Cuban Missile Crisis followed, closest we have ever come to Armageddon. And after the Vietnam War, the Shah fell, Iran seized American hostages, and the Soviet Union established naval bases in Vietnam, projected military power for the first time in Africa, and invaded Afghanistan. I would predict that this is exactly what will happen again this time around. We will drift and retreat until other nations step up, and those other nations are usually despots, not democracies, who become overconfident and then do something foolish like attack us. Then we will go back into the world again, full bore, and eventually overreach, repeating the cycle of withdrawal and overreach over and over again. Now, why do we do this? All right, I will argue because we lack a foreign policy tradition that gives us, that is intellectually, in the academic world, we lack a foreign policy tradition that keeps us in the world for a worthy cause at an acceptable cost. There are only two major traditions in thinking about American foreign policy: the realist or nationalist position / nationalist position or tradition, and the liberal internationalist tradition. The realist nationalist tradition says that our priority objective is to stay strong, to defend America, and to get involved in world affairs only if we are attacked or there is a severe threat. Nationalists generally say wait until we are attacked, usually here in the Western Hemisphere. That tradition is associated with military power, Andrew Jackson, the Monroe Doctrine, the notion of Fortress America. Realists say we may need to get involved a little bit before we're attacked because we need to balance power not only in the Western Hemisphere but also in Europe and in Asia to make sure that no country there becomes strong enough to attack us in this hemisphere. So realists are a bit more aggressive, but only to balance power. Neither nationalists nor realists are interested in spreading freedom. That complicates things, that makes things more difficult. This tradition identifies, that is, the realist tradition identifies with geopolitics, great power competition, Teddy Roosevelt, and Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger. Now, the nationalist and realist tradition generally urges us to be restrained in world affairs and let others do more, that's the nationalist hope, or be involved in world affairs beyond our hemisphere if necessary, but then only to balance power to prevent hegemons from emerging in those regions. That's the realist position. Now, the liberal internationalist tradition tells us to engage in foreign affairs, to spread freedom, promote human rights, stop genocide, build democratic nations, but to do this primarily by de-emphasizing the balance of power and creating international institutions to generate common benefits and solve disputes by negotiations and compromise. It believes that if nations cooperate with one another long enough, whether they are initially free countries or not, they will all eventually become more pluralistic, tolerant, and eventually democratic. To build trust, the liberal internationalist tradition advocates disarmament and eschews the use of force except as a last resort, after you've tried all of the diplomatic and economic maneuvers that you can. After all diplomacy and economic sanctions have failed, then you may have to use force. But it hopes ultimately to replace the use of force in international relations with global governance. Now, this tradition identifies with trade, diplomacy, Woodrow Wilson, the League of Nations, and of course, Franklin Roosevelt, the United Nations. That tradition, namely the liberal internationalist tradition, generally urges us to dive deeply into world affairs, to pursue interdependence, and eventually to share our sovereignty with other nations in a world of common international institutions and law. and it expects to do all of that without having to use much force. Now, these two traditions, I argue, yank us back and forth into world affairs. The nationalists and realists urging us to be cautious and to limit our interest to stability and balancing power, not spreading freedom. The liberal internationalist tradition urging us to spread freedom, but primarily by downplaying the role of force and cooperating with other countries through international institutions. This dialogue, or you could say, or interaction between the two traditions creates, in my judgment, the pattern of cycling back and forth in world affairs that I have mentioned. Now, what do we do about this? Well, my book lays out a third tradition, intermediate between nationalist and realism on the one hand, and liberal internationalism on the other. And I call this tradition conservative internationalism. It too is a part of our historical experience, but it has been generally neglected in the academic community and in the media, maybe in part because it's a conservative tradition, and the academy and media, as we know, are predominantly liberal. But conservative internationalism combines many of the critical parts of the other traditions. It combines the objectives of liberal internationalism, namely to spread freedom, with the instruments of realism and nationalism, namely military strength, for the purpose of preserving national sovereignty. That is, for the purpose of maintaining a world in which countries coexist with one another side by side, maintaining full sovereignty over their military as well as other capabilities. Conservative internationalism foresees a world much like the world that Thomas Jefferson talked about, sister republics living side by side, in this case sister democratic republics living side by side in a world which is not centrally organized, not many hierarchical institutions, certainly not the kind of world envisioned by liberal internationalists or by people like Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt, who eventually hoped that we would in fact surrender our sovereignty to these international institutions. Now, the archetype of conservative internationalism, I want to argue, is Ronald Reagan. And that's why this lecture is special for me. Ronald Reagan's political home in Washington was not the White House. It was the Heritage Foundation. And no one was closer to Ronald Reagan across the spectrum of domestic and international issues than Mr. Meese. So, Ed, this is an extraordinary and inestimable honor on my part to be introduced by you at this event. The Heritage Foundation has been an inspiration for me since the earliest days of the 1970s when I came to Washington and first met Ed Folder, and then had the privilege of serving with him on various Reagan transition teams, to recent decades when I've worked with colleagues here at the Heritage Foundation like Kim Holmes and Hella Dale and Jim Califano and others to try to nurture the tradition of conservative foreign policy, and particularly the legacy of Ronald Reagan. Now, when I say Reagan was the archetype of conservative internationalism, I mean the following. He came into office rejecting both the realism of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger and the liberal internationalism of Jimmy Carter. He understood instinctively that deterrence recommended by realism and détente recommended by liberal internationalism are the very forces that push America in and out of world affairs and perpetuate the cycling that I'm talking about. As John Lewis Gaddis, the dean of Cold War historians, has argued, Reagan added an essential anchor to these strategies of deterrence and détente, namely the weakening of the domestic system of the Soviet Union. The purpose of America's role in the world was not just to counterbalance and coexist with the Soviet Union, but as he said at Notre Dame already in May of 1981, he said it even long before he came into the presidency, quote, to dismiss it, that is, to dismiss the Soviet Union and communism, as some bizarre chapter in human history, whose last pages are even now being written, close quote. So Reagan brought together in his diplomacy the goals of liberal internationalism, namely to weaken despots and spread freedom, with the means of realism, namely armed diplomacy or peace through strength, and he did so for a conservative purpose, that is to create a world in which countries would retain their national sovereignty, be democratic, live side by side in peace with one another. the conception, the notion of the democratic peace, which we now actually know from academic research is a reality. That is, that countries that become democratic do not then engage in military conflicts and balance of power politics with one another. So that's the world envisioned by the conservative internationalist. A very loosely organized world with lots of room for civil society and for markets and for non-governmental interactions, and a relatively smaller role, a limited role for centralized government. As archetypical as Reagan is, though, he's not the only conservative internationalist in American history. The tradition goes back all the way to the beginning of the Republic, and that's why I took a look at other presidents, especially in the 19th century, like Thomas Jefferson and James Polk, as well as Harry Truman, who's always been one of those presidents that my liberal colleagues like to claim, and I've always resisted that and said, no, wait a minute, there were certain things about Harry Truman that were not the same as Franklin Roosevelt. And in the chapter on Truman, I try to lay out the differences between Truman and Franklin Roosevelt. Now, let me try to explain rather quickly conservative internationalism in 5 parts. First, what do I mean by conservative, all right, which will distinguish this approach from liberal internationalism. Second, what do I mean by internationalism, which will distinguish both conservative and liberal internationalists from realists and nationalists. 3, how does conservative internationalism arm its diplomacy with force, both before and during negotiations, not just after negotiations fail. 4, how does conservative internationalism then discipline the use of force? And it does so by setting priorities for spreading freedom. It sets very clear priorities. Reagan is a classic example of this. And 5th, how does conservative internationalism ultimately advance freedom through peace? That is, how does it compromise at times of maximum military leverage in order to move the needle of freedom, move the needle of domestic regimes in international affairs towards freedom, but to do it without necessarily war. Now, what do I mean by conservative? Well, Louis Hartz wrote a wonderful book 60 years ago called The Liberal Tradition in America. If the academic world had been conservative, by the way, it would have been the conservative tradition in America. But he made a very good point. He argued that both American parties were liberal in the sense that they were wedded to individual liberty, not the authority of the church, crown, or state. Namely, they were disciples of the Enlightenment, and they were dedicated to political equality. That is, not class or social discrimination in politics. In short, the legacy of the Declaration of Independence. Now, he meant that both conservatives and liberals in America are classical liberals. And he was right. There are no significant far-right or reactionary parties in America, like fascist parties in Europe. And there are no significant far-left or radical parties in America, like communist or today's socialist parties in Europe. Thus, while European parties lurched right and left over the past 100 years, American politics remained remarkably centrist. We should remember that today when we bemoan polarization in American politics. Partisanship in America plays out in the center of the political spectrum, not on the fringes, certainly not compared to Europe. Yet American conservatives and American liberals differ in important ways. American conservatives have remained classical liberals, or Republican liberals, as I like to call them, with a little r, while American liberals have become more communitarian and social. Now, that means 2 significant differences between liberals and conservatives. First, they differ on the relative emphasis that they place on individualism versus equality. Conservatives are more committed to individualism and limited government, even if it means, above a certain threshold, greater social inequality of outcomes. Liberals are more committed to activist government and social equality, even if it means at times greater restrictions on personal freedom. Conservatives support equality of opportunity, but not results. Liberals tend to support equality of results, even if to some extent it diminishes equality of opportunity. Think of affirmative action. Second, conservatives and liberals differ on the relative emphasis they place on the role of tradition versus reason in human affairs. Conservatives are more skeptical about the nature of human reason and knowledge. They doubt that you can perfect government or human society primarily by rational planning and policy making. As a result, conservatives see a greater role for tradition, religion, and virtue in human deliberations. Liberals, by contrast, are more positivist about human knowledge and more optimistic that science and expertise can improve and even perfect human decision-making in society. For liberals, society is ultimately objective, like nature. For conservatives, society can never be wholly objective, because when we study society, we study ourselves and things we like and dislike. When physicists study quarks, they don't like or dislike quarks. When we study labor unions or tea parties or whatever, or Republican parties or Democratic parties, we like and dislike them. And we can't totally separate ourselves from those prejudices. So social science will never be the objective science that physics might aspire to. Now, these domestic differences, by the way, are extremely relevant to foreign policy. All right, because they mean two things. They mean because of their commitment to limited government, conservatives do not support central institutions in the international system any more than they do at home. They prefer, as Jefferson did, a world of sister democratic republics living side by side, retaining control of their national security and of their national sovereignty, indeed retaining their arms, retaining separate arms. It's kind of a Second Amendment right for nations in the world, just like we have the protection under the Second Amendment of our rights to arm as individuals inside this country. And because of the commitment to tradition and religion, conservatives do not think that the advance of liberty is just a matter of time, something that's going to happen automatically as science and modernization progress and slowly civilize, if not democratize, all peoples. Conservatives see the advance of liberty more as a struggle, not as an inevitable trajectory of history. Indeed, a moral struggle with despots who do not go away peacefully. Now, Jefferson was, I think, a marvelous example of both of these propositions of conservatism. He always put the individual and self-government first. He had this wonderful line in his first inaugural address, and let me quote it. "Sometimes it is said that man cannot be trusted with the government of himself. Can he then be trusted with the government of others?" End quote. By the way, that was a line which Ronald Reagan used over and over again. He used it in his inaugural, he paraphrased it. He used it in a letter that he sent to Brezhnev already in April of 1981. It is a remarkable statement, I think, of the conservative faith. In other words, if we don't have individuals who can govern themselves at the local level, their families, their neighborhoods, their businesses, their communities, then what business do they have governing others at the national level? Jefferson also put the public square above science and expertise in working out decisions within our republic. He said, and here I quote again, "If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union or to change its republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments to the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated, where reason is left free to combat it." In other words, he said his commitment was to the public square. His commitment was to the people. He wanted to educate the people. He said he wanted to be remembered as the founder of the University of Virginia, even before being remembered as the President of the United States. But he believed that ultimately ordinary people with some degree of education could make decisions better than the experts. He never looked to the courts, for example, in his day to make decisions, and that's quite remarkable. He never asked the courts to declare the Alien and Sedition Acts unconstitutional. He simply said, look, the people have already spoken on that. The elections of 1800 and 1804 took care of that issue. And by the way, those were pretty severe violations of our civil rights in those days. Some 300 journalists, all Republican journalists, all supporters of Jefferson, were imprisoned. Not a single one of the Federalist journalists were imprisoned. Now, Reagan had very similar views to this. As I mentioned, he's quoted Jefferson's line often. And he had this wonderful comment already, by the way, in an address he gave at the William Woods College in Fulton, Missouri in 1952. And he said the following, this is, quote, again a quote, "America is less a place than an idea. The idea of the dignity of man, the idea that deep within the heart of each of us is something so godlike and precious that no individual or group has a right to impose his or her will upon the people." End quote. Now to my second point. What do I mean by international? In foreign policy, this, by the way, is a big issue. Should foreign policy be primarily about national security, or should it be about the spreading of freedom? This is a big divide. It's a big issue that divides sort of realists and nationalists on the one hand and liberal internationalists on the other hand. It's also, I might add, a big divide, I think, within the Republican Party. And so it's a very important sort of issue for us to try to wrestle with. Nationalists and realists generally say, look, foreign policy is principally about security. Don't get involved in regime change. It's only going to complicate matters. It'll draw you in further than you need to be. And so generally the nationalist and realist position cautions us against regime change. The liberal internationalists, on the other hand, tell us it's primarily about regime change. It's primarily about spreading liberty. All right, in the words of Woodrow Wilson, in order to make the world safe for democracy. Now, how do we sort of bring these two together? Well, Reagan did it, I thought, in the only way that at least makes sense to me. First, he made it clear that freedom in America always came first, a good, solid nationalist position. He said the following at the Republican Convention in 1964, quote, "If we lose freedom here in America, there is no place to escape to," end quote. He knew that this is where it all starts, but he also knew that this is not where it ends. He also urged the United States not to be indifferent to the great moral struggles that move history. Before the National Association of Evangelicals in March of 1983, he said the following, quote, "I urge you to beware of the temptation of pride, the assumption of blithely declaring yourselves above it all, and thereby to remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil." Reagan never flinched from talking about the importance of democracy wherever he went, Shanghai, Moscow, even at the end of his presidency. He was very clear in Moscow. He said, "We hope that the Soviet government will understand that it is the individual who is always the source of economic creativity. And in order for that individual to create, he must have a sense of just that, his own individuality. And that others respect him, and yes, that his own nation respects him enough to grant him all of his civil rights." He said that in Moscow when, he was supposed to be friendly, not raise any difficult issues with Mr. Gorbachev. So Reagan understood that we have to bring freedom in America and freedom in the world, we have to bring them together. And I personally think that they actually reinforce one another. I don't think we can have the one without the other. When we didn't care about freedom in the interwar period before World War II, between World War I and World War II, the Ku Klux Klan reached its peak in America. And it always startles me to look at the pictures of the Ku Klux Klan marching down Pennsylvania Avenue, 30,000 strong in the 1920s, white-sheeted wizards walking down Pennsylvania Avenue. After the war, by the way, after World War II, what do? We became more engaged in world affairs than we ever have been before in the fight against communism. And what did? We made more progress on human rights at home, civil rights at home than we had since the Civil War. So I don't really think there's an issue here, at least in my judgment. Now, if we're going to be serious, however, about this internationalist position, namely that we need to spread freedom, we can't just be satisfied with the securing of freedom in America, although that comes first, then we're going to have to look hard at the question of, okay, how do we do this? Do we do this primarily by example, which is what nationalists recommend? Do we do it primarily by cooperating multilaterally through international institutions, which is what liberal internationalists recommend? Or are we going to have to arm our diplomacy at some point? Are we going to have to bring our military might to the cause at some point? Now, conservative internationalism says we're going to have to do the latter. And that's the third point. We're going to have to arm our diplomacy. And by the way, this is for one very simple reason. If we're serious about this, we confront despots who do arm their diplomacy and who arm it daily in order to sustain their power at home and in order to work their will abroad. So if we have any understanding of the reality that we face in addressing the spread of freedom in the world, we're going to confront despots who use force. We're going to have our diplomacy armed by force in order to confront them. Now, let me be clear, when I speak about force, I'm speaking about military force. I'm not just speaking about economic or diplomatic sanctions. And I'm speaking about the use of force in ways other than, including, but in ways other than just military intervention. I'm also speaking about the buildup of military force, often prior to negotiations. I'm talking about the deployment of forces, all right, prior to any kind of a conflict. And then, of course, I'm also talking about the actual insertion of military forces into conflict situations. I'm also not saying that liberal internationalists don't want to use force. They, of course, do use force vigorously after we're attacked. They just have a preference for starting negotiations without any use of force or without any buildup of armaments. And that's premised on their idea that we need to cultivate shared and common interests, all right, in order to get negotiations going, in order to build trust. And therefore, we should keep military power off the table while we negotiate. We should negotiate in every other way, but not bring military force to bear because it'll disrupt the negotiations, it'll create distrust, and we're trying to create trust. And therefore, you keep it off the table until all of these other options fail. Now, the difficulty with that is if your despotic adversary knows that you're going to keep the use of military force off the table while you're negotiating with them, they are going to very happily negotiate with you for as long as you want, while they proceed to use force outside the negotiations to achieve their objectives. Think about Iran today. It's a good example of this point. So conservative internationalists say you're going to have to arm your diplomacy both before and during negotiations, not just after negotiations. And force in this case serves three fundamental purposes. All right, it serves a purpose of creating background leverage in order to get the attention of your adversaries. All right, this was the buildup of the American military and economic power, which Reagan engaged in when he came into office. When Reagan came into office, he looked at the constraints that he faced, and he said, I don't like them. I don't like the situation. I think the Soviets are actually right. The correlation of forces are in their favor. I'm going to change those constraints. I'm going to create a military and economic power, bar none, here in the United States. That was his first priority. Right? He never said he wasn't going to negotiate, but he certainly wasn't going to negotiate from a position of weakness, because he wanted to convince the Soviet Union that there was some reason to negotiate. If you aren't strong, there aren't many reasons why your adversary is going to want to negotiate with you. Secondly, military force provides leverage on the ground during negotiations for you to push back when the adversary uses force outside the negotiations. So Reagan did that brilliantly with INF. I mean, if they're deploying SS-20 weapons in Eastern Europe, we're going to push back. We're going to deploy INF weapons in Western Europe. He pushed back as well with his freedom fighters. If they're going to invade Afghanistan, we're going to do whatever we can to support those freedom fighters in Afghanistan and make it as costly as possible for the Russians, so that they see the benefit of coming to the negotiating table and talking with us about these things. Here again, I'm thinking about our position in the Middle East and with respect to Iran. Where's the leverage on the ground? We've actually repositioned forces out of the Middle East and into Asia. Extraordinary sort of neglect of this aspect of force during the process of negotiation. Finally, of course, force in negotiations gives you bargaining chips, all right, for trade-off. In the end, that's what INF became. It became a trade-off. Reagan said already in 1983, we'll never get them to reduce the SS-20s until we have something to trade off. And sure enough, as soon as we did deploy the INFs later that year, the Soviets came back to the table, and eventually that was the first, by the way, agreement that reduced, a category of arms to zero, the INF agreement of 1987. Leverage inside negotiations, boy, there's where Reagan used brilliantly his strategic defense initiative. Now, mind you, it wasn't for trading off for Reagan, because it had a role to play in deterrence after we reduced offensive nuclear systems. But it certainly got the Soviets' attention inside negotiations. Now, in all of these ways, Conservative internationalism says you're going to have to arm your diplomacy. You're going to have to be serious about this. Now, it does confront a problem at this point. Namely, isn't this where the realists step in and usually tell us, yeah, but look, you're trying to accomplish too much with too little, or if you're going to increase your military capabilities to support your objectives across the board, you're either going to you're pretty quickly going to get into all kinds of military engagements, and isn't that a problem? And isn't that where we wind up as we are today after our efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan? Well, conservative internationalism has an answer for this, and Ronald Reagan had an answer for this. And that answer is you set very clear priorities about where freedom is important and where for the moment it is not so important. And where is freedom important? All right? I argue, and I think that this is the case, and Reagan argued, that there were essentially two main fault lines of freedom today in the world. And that was along the border of existing freedom. All right, and that was the fault line in Europe between free countries in the West and not so free countries in the East, and it was the fault line in Asia between China on the one hand and the free countries of Asia. These are the main sort of battle lines in the pursuit and in the spread, in the defense and in the spread of freedom in the world. And what happens on these borders is a lot more important than what happens in regions remote from these borders. Now let me give you some examples. All right? Today in Europe, this line would run from the Baltic states down through some troubled states like Ukraine, Moldova, on down to Turkey, probably not yet into the Caucasus, all right, because they're not that close yet to the free countries. I'm looking at the countries that are right on the border of free countries, all right, that are being pulled one way by Russia in the case of Ukraine, the other way by the West in the case of the European Union. And I'm saying that the stakes in Ukraine are a lot higher than they are in Iraq or than they are in Afghanistan. And that American policy should recognize that. Reagan was extremely good about this. People say today he built up a lot of force, but he never used it. And look, he took Marines out of Lebanon. He never really got engaged except covertly in Central America, et cetera. Well, that's not quite the case. Reagan was building up force to deal with a central problem in his day, which was Central Europe. And he wanted to make sure that, in fact, he had the capability to deal with the Soviet Union in Central Europe. He never accepted the Yalta Agreement. He said that's one agreement that was not legitimate. And he said that as late as February of 1985, publicly at the 40th anniversary of the Yalta Agreement. So his focus was on rolling back communism in Central Europe. And that's where his force was directed. He had a conversation with Cap Weinberg in July of 1981 when, remember the Polish situation was in play. And the Soviets had some 20 divisions mobilizing on the borders of Poland. And he asked Cap, he said, Cap, what could we do about that? Cap said, Mr. President, we can't do anything about it. And then Reagan says to him, this is recorded in his diary, he says, Cap, I don't ever want to be in that position again. So in other words, build up my forces, give me some capability. I think Ronald Reagan would have used force in Central Europe if he had to. That's where he cared about the defense and ultimately the spread of freedom. Now, in recent years, we've been doing just the opposite. That is, we have been getting heavily involved in remote areas to try to build democracy, Iraq and Afghanistan, and we have exhausted the American people in the process. And so the question is, what do we do in those regions? What do we do if we face a threat in these regions now remote from the central borders of freedom or the central battle lines of freedom? Well, my argument is you go in and take care of the threat, all right, which we were certainly obligated to do in the case of Afghanistan and I think also in the case of Iraq. But then you don't stay for 10 years to try to build a perfect democracy. Yes, you're going to leave behind a weak government, but look at the weak governments we're leaving behind after 10 years. And today we can't go back in, almost regardless of what happens in those countries. This is the same situation we faced after Vietnam. And it's why, of course, the Soviet Union made some, took some advantage of that situation in Vietnam. We couldn't go back in. So my argument is we ought to go in, take care of the threat, put in a little bit better government than what was there before, but then get back out and be ready to go in again, so that as time goes on, you can ratchet those governments towards greater freedom. But you don't expend your resources to the point where you exhaust the willingness and the capability of the American people to support the spread and defense of freedom where it's most important. I actually believe in the last 10 years we've hurt freedom in Ukraine, for example, because we haven't been paying attention. And we've been making sort of deals with Putin that don't seem to pay a lot of attention to the objectives of the Western-oriented groups in Ukraine. And we probably also weakened freedom in Turkey because we didn't pay enough attention to that country in the process of invading Iraq. Well, let me come to my last and final point. I hope I haven't yet disappointed, or I haven't yet confirmed Eisenhower's prediction, but pretty close. My fifth point. It's also true, I think, and very important to realize that in the contemporary world, when we are arming diplomacy in order to achieve better outcomes in negotiations, our hope, of course, is not to have to use the arms. Be ready to, if necessary, but hopefully not to have to use them. Now, one way in which that's done, especially in a world of nuclear weapons, is to know when to compromise. That is, to know when to cash in your military leverage for diplomatic gains. Take a half a loaf or 3/4 of a loaf today, come back for the rest the next day or the day after. Now, Reagan, again, was extremely good about this point. He knew exactly what he wanted and when he would go for it. He talked about negotiations from the very beginning of his administration, but he didn't yet have the leverage that he was looking for. When he finally got the leverage, here's what he was saying in May of '83 in his diary, and I quote, because some of his advisors were kind of nervous that he was getting ready to negotiate. Well, Reagan was getting ready to negotiate. He says, "I think I'm hard line and will never appease, but I do want to try and let the Soviet Union see that there's a better world if they show by deed that they want to get along with the free world." So, and Reagan followed that throughout his, he made some very timely compromises. He understood that you can do everything with force and bayonets, as Napoleon once remarked, except sit on them. That is, at some point, the military conflict ends, and then diplomacy has to follow. Even, by the way, if you pursue force to unconditional surrender, you have then something like unconditional nation building facing you. Because if you pursue military victory to that point, you're going to have to rebuild those societies. So maybe there are better ways along the way, or there are other times along the way when you can make compromises, move things forward, all right, and be in a great position then to do it again the following day if necessary. James Polk was just a master at this. An underrated president, and as Mr. Meese and I were talking about before we came into the room, I hope a president that, who deserves a lot more credit than he gets, and who unfortunately enjoys a legacy of neglect, in part because we don't have this tradition of conservative internationalism that would support the kind of thing that he did. He was sitting, American forces were sitting in Mexico City in February of 1848, controlling the entire country. The All-Mexico movement had reached a peak in the American Congress. Polk could have easily said, okay, we're just going to take the country for a while. It's what they wanted. Occupy. No, he said he took an agreement that was negotiated by an aide, by an envoy, whom he had fired just 3 months earlier, Nicholas Trist. But it met his bottom line, and it followed his policy, which was always when he escalated the use of military force, he always sent a diplomatic envoy in order to see if at that point now we couldn't get an agreement. So he got his bottom line. He accepted this agreement even from an envoy who had violated his instructions. He then went to Congress in 3 weeks. He rammed it through Congress. By July of 1848, not an American soldier was left in Mexico City. Boy, I think of that as an example of what if we had done that? Maybe, I don't know, possible, in Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan. He knew when to close a deal and move out, and of course he got exactly what he wanted, and in the long run, it was a good outcome for all of us, including, I realize there's still some Mexicans who don't think it was such a good outcome, but most I think would. Well, that's what conservative internationalism is all about. To summarize, conservative, it means dedicated to limited government and seeing progress as a moral struggle for freedom. It means internationalist, that is, being interested in the spread of freedom and changing the types of domestic regimes around the world. And finally, it also means then arming your diplomacy for freedom and peace, that is, setting priorities for your diplomacy, using force early so that you may have to use less later, and then ultimately trading off your military advantages. If we had an approach that was both inspiring and measured, as I think this approach is, liberal internationalism is inspiring, but it's not very effective. Realism is a measured approach, but it's also not very inspiring. If we could bring the two together, I think we would have a way to, in the long run, avoid the cycling, which I mentioned at the outset and which has been so debilitating to America's presence in the world. All right.
Henry, thank you for your brilliant analysis and your overview of what has happened with past presidents and what that tells us as far as the present and the future. At this point, we open it up to the questions from the audience, and I believe we have someone with a microphone. We do. Please wait till you get the microphone. The first question will be up here.
Hello. You can't see me, so. Hey, Walter Lohman, I'm here with the Heritage Foundation. A lot of what you described sounds like neoconservatism. Can you tell us how you define neoconservatism and how you distinguish it from conservative internationalism?
Right. No, excellent. I wondered if that was some of my academic friends have always said, "Oh, Henry, that's the first question you're going to get when you talk about this in Washington." Look, here I'm trying to address a problem that has existed for me for 50 years in the academic world, where there has been no conservative internationalism or neoconservatism, for that matter, I've been trying to understand why that is, all right? And I've been trying to find a way to sort of address my colleagues in the academic world with the existence, because I think this tradition has existed all along, but with the effort to try to revive it and to try to give it some strength. Now, I think it incorporates and includes neoconservatives. Neoconservatives, for example, were very strong on the notion of arming your diplomacy. And to some extent, that idea in the pursuit of freedom is a neoconservative idea. All right? Liberal internationalism being less likely to use force for that purpose, and the early neoconservatives were unhappy, Scoop Jackson and others, unhappy with the Democratic Party and its failure to put enough force behind its policy of defending and spreading freedom. So I think they contribute a lot to that understanding. By the way, realists do as well, because they've always talked about arming diplomacy, but then they don't have a very inspiring purpose for that. And you get, for example, a realist president like George H.W. Bush carrying out a magnificent realist operation. I mean, ultimately it was a realist operation, that is the first Persian Gulf War, even though it's also an example of collective security, as I tell my students. But it was for the purpose of restoring sovereignty in Kuwait, period. That's why it did not go beyond that, didn't go to Baghdad. He carried out a brilliant sort of foreign policy effort under the rubric of realism, or maybe even under the rubric of liberal internationalism. And what happened to him 18 months later? He was voted out of office. You know, the American people are not going to stay with you on a sustained basis, I think, when you arm your diplomacy for something less than ultimately defending and spreading freedom. Neoconservatives don't encompass the whole of what I'm talking about by any means, and that's partly what I'm hoping to make clear, both to us as well as to my academic colleagues. Many of them, by the way, were not conservative domestically. But that's okay. I mean, you know, foreign policy is not always perfectly, perfectly integrated with domestic policy. But many of them were what I call reform conservatives, who were more eager to use government, all right, for conservative causes. I'm thinking now in particular of Irving Kristol and so on, who talked about, and maybe even Moynihan, who talked about using government for the purpose of strengthening families. There's some reform conservatives today who think about using government for the purpose of faith, of strengthening faith-based institutions, et cetera. So they're a part of this coalition, no question about it. But this is a much broader, I think, sort of concept. And by the way, there's a huge hole in the academic literature. When I put a slide up, I usually do this in the academic world, but I put a slide up with a little matrix that shows kind of the preference for security versus spreading democracy and the preference for force and diplomacy. And there's a box there that's just totally empty. And that's the box for conservative internationalism. So we also need to be thinking, by the way, about a big tent. I mean, we're in that phase right now in our public discussion about both domestic and foreign policy as we approach the 2014 and then 2016 elections. My hope is that somehow or other there are elements in this that can appeal to almost every member of the conservative community, including the nationalists, who I think are very important element of the conservative movement. You know, they don't always have all the right answers. They have some of the right answers, and we need to put these good parts of these other traditions together.
Question over here.
Thank you. My name's John Sullivan with the Center for International Private Enterprise. Thank you very much for that presentation. I hope that it looks like you were reading from written remarks. I hope they're going to be available. I'd like to ask you to reflect on another tradition of President Ronald Reagan, which he first enunciated at Westminster in 1982, and then again in the Indian Treaty Room when he signed the National Endowment for Democracy Act. His two speeches are just brilliant. I don't know how they fit into the picture that you painted. What he did was call for the creation of the National Endowment, which comprised the AFL-CIO, CITE, Center for International Private Enterprise, not everybody may be, the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute. Lane Kirkland, Dante Fascell, a host of other people, Orrin Hatch, all joined in to help get this idea across. But its central core was what President Reagan, in a brilliant sentence, enunciated: the need to build the infrastructure of democracy through these institutions. And he was reflecting also that one of the motivations for this was that the United States could not intervene, didn't have an instrument to intervene in Franco-Spain, in Italy, in Greece, after the fall of the colonels.
Yeah, no, excellent point, and it fits directly into, of course, Reagan's view that we could not just be in the world for the purpose of securing our defense, that we had to be in the world for the purpose of building the infrastructure of freedom. I'll have to send you an article, because I wrote an article about his democracy initiative and the institutions that he created. Do you know that very few people know that he was the one who, in fact, initiated that legislation and who supported that legislation? And I'm talking about very few people in my world, all right, because when I did that paper, I was on a panel at one of our conventions, and people were surprised to find out that Ronald Reagan did that. Really? So this is part of this legacy issue we were talking about in the green room before the meeting. We've got a lot of work to do to make people understand what Ronald Reagan was all about and what conservative internationalism is all about. So those institutions live on. They're doing their work today. They're doing their work sometimes so effectively they get kicked out of some countries when they take an authoritarian turn, as we've seen in both Moscow and in Egypt and in other places. So this is all Ronald Reagan's legacy, and we have a responsibility to make that more widely known.
Over here.
Al Millikenam Media. When you talk about Harry Truman, who do you see influencing him, and do you see Truman directly influencing Ronald Reagan?
Well, I think what really struck me when I did this book is that Truman and Reagan are really the bookends of the Cold War, and they thought a lot alike. They really did. Now, Truman is the one president I studied who domestically was more liberal, all right, than the other presidents. But he was only sort of half liberal. That is, he believed in activist government. He was the first one to propose national health care, Truman Care. But he was conservative on the other dimension that I mentioned. He was conservative on the importance of religion and virtue and tradition affecting our way of thinking. And let me just suggest briefly how that affected him. I think he saw more quickly that he was not going to be able to deal effectively with Stalin and with communism because of the ideology than Franklin Roosevelt ever would have. All right, now we don't know because he didn't live. But Truman did something in the May of 1945 that people often, my colleagues often point to, showing that he was really a liberal internationalist. That is, he refused Churchill's advice to use the presence of American military forces in Czechoslovakia, where we had moved beyond the lines agreed to at Yalta, to negotiate a better deal in Poland. Churchill was pleading with Truman to do this in May of 1945, and Truman refused. Now, later, Truman regretted that. So he was in office only a few weeks, surrounded by Roosevelt's advisors. He was getting his legs, so to speak. But his instincts already told him that, wait a minute, I should be a little bit more aggressive here because they're certainly going to be aggressive. Then he does something in early 1946 that Franklin Roosevelt, quite frankly, would have never done. That is, he invites Churchill to Fulton, Missouri, rides with him on the train, reads the text of Churchill's speech, and that's the speech in which Churchill rang down the Iron Curtain. So that's the speech in some sense that ignited the Cold War. Roosevelt would have never done that. He always thought Churchill was trying to maneuver him into another war with the Soviet Union to save, or with Stalin to save to save the British Commonwealth. Finally, of course, I think the really telling point for Truman came by the spring of 1947, where he was willing to draw the distinction between the United States and the Soviet Union in terms of ideology, in terms of domestic ideology. And he did in his Truman Doctrine, 2 ways of life, he said. And then his commitment to use force for that purpose, that is to defend and spread our way of life, was really vindicated in 1948, June of 1948, when all of his advisors urged him to get out of West Berlin when the Soviets blockaded West Berlin. Every one of them, including his Secretary of State Marshall. Truman in that meeting just said, gentlemen, we are staying, period. And that was the beginning of the arming of American diplomacy in the Cold War. So Truman and Reagan thought an awful lot alike. And for that reason, I think, both created and then brought the Cold War to the victorious end.
John?
I'm John Linchowski from the Institute of World Politics in Washington. Henry, I just want to congratulate you for a brilliant presentation. I'd like to ask you, though, a little bit about one distinction which has to do with the first question about neoconservatism. And maybe this is getting a little bit politically sectarian on the face of it, but as you know, in international relations theory, this divide between the realist nationalists and the liberal internationalists is also understood to be a division between, let's say, realists and idealists, quote unquote.
Yeah.
And idealism has tended to move in the direction of utopianism because, like domestic liberals and leftists, it tends to believe in the malleability of human nature, the perfectibility of man, and even in international relations, the malleability of culture. One of my problems with the Iraq War was we went in and we assumed that we could, shape Iraqi culture as if it didn't exist, as if centuries of customs, traditions, mentality, ways of life could all of a sudden be changed. Sectarian differences and everything else in what I consider to have been a utopian business. Now, I was involved actually in the creation, one of the cooks in the kitchen when it came to the National Endowment for Democracy in the Reagan years, but I would have called it the National Endowment for Liberty and not democracy. I lost that fight. to the neoconservatives, who I believe had this general sort of idealistic view that borders sometimes on utopianism. And I'm wondering if, in fact, truly conservative internationalism is more realistic about the possibilities of what can be done in exporting freedom. I mean, in some countries are more amenable to it, others are less so. And then there's the whole question of using the ideas of freedom and democracy too, simply as ideological weapons, which is one of the things that was done in the case of the Soviet Union, as opposed to actually believing that we can transform this overnight into some kind of a great new,
Absolutely.
clone of the United States.
Yeah. Well, I don't disagree with the thing you said. And I think it's important to understand that conservatism is cautious. It's cautious because of this commitment to tradition, to religion, to virtue, this notion of a fallible man, all right? But not to the point, by the way, where we don't think we can make progress. I mean, we're not, pre-Enlightenment people. And look, I mean, some conservatives who probably wouldn't even identify themselves as conservatives, but some members of the neoconservative community jumped ship precisely on this point. I'm thinking of Francis Fukuyama, who wrote a book about how he couldn't go along ultimately with that notion that somehow or other it was going to be that easy to change countries. So many people today want us to talk about the promotion of liberty, freedom, rather than the promotion of democracy. And interestingly, I want to I don't know yet the case of Reagan's work, because my next book is going to be on Ronald Reagan, and I'm going to be interested to see how much he talked about freedom versus democracy. Because, look, freedom is more essential, all right, in the sense that it allows for every culture to kind of figure out how to do it on their own. On the other hand, there are certain, criteria for a free country. And in my mind, that's always been laid out by the democratic scales, all right, that we have for measuring countries, and that heritage has been so important and Freedom House has been so important in developing. And there we have three sort of very important criteria, and I don't think we want to lose sight of them. The first is the notion of opposing parties rotating in power peacefully through free and fair elections. That's a mouthful, and that's a lot, all right? But that's one criteria. A second, of course, is that bureaucracies, that is, all the institutions of the society, most importantly the military institution, are accountable to those elected officials. Because if they aren't, as we see today, for example, in Egypt or earlier in Turkey, you don't really have a free country. And then finally, civil rights, the hardest one, maybe. That is protection of basic civil liberties and individualism, which may be difficult in some countries that have cultures of communitarianism. All right, but I think we can insist upon to some degree, these criteria for what we mean by freedom, but then allow for a lot of innovation and improvisation on the part of other countries. I love the way Reagan talked about it when he was in Moscow, because he talked about it as if he was saying, gosh, can't you Soviet people come up with some ideas like maybe this or like maybe that? He was encouraging them to come out of their culture and be free. I do think, like he thinks, and I know you think, that, look, everybody wants to be free. Individuals want to have some control of their lives and their families and their neighborhoods under whatever culture or religion they exist. And we need to lead that effort without this utopian or this notion that, by the way, that it doesn't cost much. That's how we lose the support of the American people. That's one reason why I'm very concerned about these latter 2 points I made about how you discipline the spread of freedom by focusing on the battle for freedom on the borders of existing freedom, and then how you compromise at a timely point before your military leverage wanes. I mean, one of the unfortunate things I think about George W. Bush's diplomacy after Iraq is that he didn't take an initiative to deal with the diplomatic follow-up until 4 years later, basically. So these are good lessons for us to.
Kim?
Henry, let me join everyone else in congratulating you not on your excellent presentation, but on your wonderful book. I encourage everyone to read it, tell other people about it, to read it. Henry and I have talked for many years now about how there's a vacuum in this intellectual area, that we need more kinds of work like this. And so I just want to congratulate you on that, and thank you for doing this. And General Meese, thank you for hosting this for us. You know, you mentioned that Harry Truman and Ronald Reagan were bookends in the Cold War. That's a great metaphor. It's as far as I see it, it's absolutely right. But it raises an interesting question, because Harry Truman was, at the time, considered to be a liberal internationalist in the tradition of Woodrow Wilson and progressivism. So what we call Cold War liberalism, that started with Truman and worked its way all the way up, I would say, to Kennedy and to a certain extent Johnson, but more particularly in Kennedy. And then you had the 60s, you had the Vietnam War, the break in the Democratic Party, the rise of McGovern and people like that, and you had that great divide that occurred there in liberal internationalism. Mm-hmm. So then you have in the 1980s, you have Ronald Reagan coming back and reverting back to the progressive view of the world under Truman, Cold War liberalism and the bookends, that, as you mentioned. So this raises the question, what is liberal internationalism today? Mm-hmm. I call it the new international liberalism because of that break in the 60s. It's a different worldview than Harry Truman. It's certainly a different worldview than Reagan. It's a view of the world that America sinned, that America was an imperialistic power, that we provoked these conflicts. You know the whole drill. Yeah. It comes from, I think, the influence of the New Left in the 50s and the 60s, but that is now the dominant view in the academic world. Yeah. That's sort of my view of it. Do you see it that way, or am I off base?
No. I think you see it exactly right. I mean, look, there's a little bit of a crisis going on in liberal internationalism, which we can exploit, or which I'd like to see us exploit. There's a book that my colleague at Princeton, John Eikenberry, has written called "The Crisis in American Foreign Policy," and it's an effort by liberal internationalists to try to reclaim turf that they think that was taken from them. And then abused in the policies of the neoconservatives. Well, I'm thinking I hope they get distracted by that debate, because I don't want us to be distracted for much longer by that debate. I want us to focus on what conservative internationalism is and how it contrasts with liberal internationalism. Today, liberal internationalism is doing two things. It's reverting, as you say, to the notion that we're the problems all around the world, not the despots, and it's reverting to the notion that we should back off from the spread of democracy. This is one reason why I'm not too keen to go too far in that direction, because they want to back off. They talk now about simply liberty and freedom or human rights, and they don't talk about the need, in fact, to create institutions that do allow people to see some control over their own lives through divided institutions and through elections and so on. So they want to back off that because, after all, if we go too far, we're going to get in trouble, just like we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. The other direction in which they want to go, of course, is multilateralism. Now they talk about not multilateralism through the United Nations, but multilateralism. That is, we're going to do this through a decentralized system of multilateral institutions. They'll all have individual responsibilities, and they'll take care of the world for us. This is kind of a reversion back to functionalism. It was a way of thinking about international organization that was popular, I know, in Britain during World War II, popularized by David Mitrani. So they're having a debate internally about who they are. By the way, Peter Beinart, who's in that community, he's a liberal internationalist who doesn't like the pulling away from the use of force that is going on in that community. So they're having a debate about all that. I would wish them luck, and I would simply say that we ought to sort of understand. I mean, I make this case now very strongly to my academics. You wrestle with me on the facts with Harry Truman. And I will show you step by step why Harry Truman is a conservative internationalist and not a liberal internationalist. And I think we need to kind of really, stake out that turf and say, listen, we've been around a long time. Yeah, you guys have run this institution for the last, 3 or 4 decades, this institution of the academy. But we haven't gone away, and maybe the next 4 or 5 decades are going to be our decades in the academy. And people will, I'm pleading with my students, my colleagues, to make sure they read this book. At least they don't teach a course on foreign policy without reading this book, so that they get a chance to see what an alternative conservative view of internationalism, someone who cares about freedom now, not just about security, what it looks like. And I think we have a good
I have a
future.
suggestion for your next book, which is Reagan gave us a fundamental principle, which is, for foreign affairs, which is trust and verify.
Yeah, that's the verify.
So that
Good.
should be the Reagan underneath, trust and verify.
We have a lot of other questions. Unfortunately, the tyranny of the clock causes us to stop at this particular point. But again, Henry, thank you very much. We appreciate both the book and your presentation here this morning.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
And the books are available outside.